I just need time to rest. And to be very, very honest, I just want to be bored. My brain just never has time to just process all of the information that's there, and I don't have the time to think through it all. And I do believe and know that that contributes even more to my level of exhaustion. And so that means in the next year, hey there, risers and thrivers. Welcome to On the Up and Up, the podcast created to encourage critical conversations, share and amplify the untold stories and achievements of the underrepresented and underestimated, and inspire visionaries like yourself to pursue their dreams. So those of you that are new to the podcast, welcome. My name is Janine. I am the creator and host of On the Up and Up. And to be honest, this is not your typical episode, so if you were hoping to hear an interview, I would definitely say check out one of the other 20 episodes, but this one's a little bit different. Why is that? Well, first of all, as things go with podcasting, I had an episode planned for this one, but that didn't happen because there was a huge audio issue with the episode for the guest. So I ended up having to reach out to the guest and asking to reschedule. But at the same time, I didn't want to mess up the posting schedule. So I decided, let's just make lemonade out of lemons. Right? That's how that goes. Yeah, make lemonade out of lemons and turn a negative situation into, or sour situation, since we're gonna have the lemon pun, into a bit more of a sweet one. So with that, I thought, okay, actually On the Up and Up turned a year old on September 10th. Yay! So just a couple of weeks ago. And with that, I was feeling anyway retrospective and wanting to look back on the past. And I thought, you know what? Let me just take an episode to reflect on the last year of podcasting. So for those of you that are listening, this episode is essentially split into two parts. The first part, going to be a bit of a walk down memory lane, reflecting on the highs, the lows, and the lessons learned of podcasting. This is, of course, potentially helpful for anyone who's interested in podcasting themselves or content creation. On the other hand, maybe it's just cathartic for me to talk about these kind of things. So if you're interested, that's what the first half of this episode is about. On the other hand, I'm going to be taking the second part of this episode to reflect on myself personally and my journey on the up and up, not only as it relates to the podcast, but also my journey on the up and up in my career and personally. So that's what the second half of this episode is about. With that being said, diving into part one, the walk down memory lane. To kick off, actually, for those of you, especially those of you that are new here, or those of you who just joined in for a random episode in the past, why did I create On the Up and Up? Actually, it started with my own personal journey back in 2020. At the time, I was doing my master's in entrepreneurship, and I got into a program from Factory Berlin called the Stealth Mode Program, which was a bit of like an accelerator, more like an accelerator program to help entrepreneurs who were women, people of color, Flinta, kind of just get the lessons and the learnings that they need to get their companies off the ground. And at the time, while I was building the company, I quickly learned what everyone talks about in the ecosystem of the biases, the prejudices that one has to face as a woman, as a person of color. And then on top of it, at that time, there was a program, I would say, for every form of minority there could possibly be. There was a program for Black people, there was a program for POCs, there was a program for women. And yet, when I would look at the statistics in the ecosystem, funding for underrepresented entrepreneurs was getting worse. So for example, I think at that time, there was a stat that I had found that funding for women-led companies had gone from 3% to 1%. Which I was like, okay, the 3% is already abysmal, but 1%, especially when we have all of these programs for every dichotomy of underrepresented there is, like, obviously something has to be wrong. So at that point, I was like, you know what? Let me do some research into this. While I liked the business idea that I was working on, I'll be very honest, I was not that passionate enough about it, and I'm a bit of a data and a research dork, and I was more passionate about understanding why the ecosystem was having the problem it had. So that kicked off in me working on my master's thesis around the experiences of women of color and female minority entrepreneurs, which also then trickled into my collaboration with Founderland, where we published a research report on the experiences of women of color entrepreneurs, especially those based in Germany and in Berlin. And then I also collaborated with an organization called ADAN, so the Afro-German Academics Network, where we built the first ADAN Elevate Accelerator program, which I led. And then eventually, we launched the research report, and that was really fantastic, and hearing all the hype and everything about it. But at the same time, I was also seeing that within the ecosystem, there was initially a lot of hype around diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, it was definitely dying down, and also it seemed like there was a bit of a pushback and a bit of like a negative retaliation around the whole topic of DEI and supporting people from underrepresented and underfunded backgrounds, underprivileged backgrounds. And at the same time, let me tell y'all something. Launching a research report and conducting research is amazing. However, once you've launched the report, you probably have like a hype period of a couple of weeks until that dies down. And I thought to myself, like, okay, if we really want to create a change, you gotta have consistent conversations around these topics, but also for the people who are experiencing these challenges, you want to see the positive too. Like, it's exhausting to always talk about the challenges you're facing and hearing about the challenges. Like, I know what I go through as a Black woman, right? But I want to see other Black women doing really well and feel inspired by them. And so that's where a lot of the inspiration for my podcast came to be. I'll be very transparent. I talked about building On the Up and Up for like 2 years. And then finally, I was just getting embarrassed by people being like, so what about your podcast? Didn't you want to create a podcast? How about that podcast? And I was like, yeah. So eventually I was like, you know what? Go time. Let me just put a date on it and let me just get out there and start the podcast. And that's when On the Up and Up went live last year in September with its first episode. Huge shout out to Ali for being my first guest, because honestly, being the first guest on a podcast that has like nobody on it, it's kind of taking a bit of a leap of faith on the podcaster and the person who's creating it. So I'm really grateful for everyone who joined me for season 1 and also supported. To the next thing, because I always get this question from everyone, is what does On the Up and Up mean? And when you look online, you kind of get contrasting definitions of On the Up and Up. But colloquially and more informally, On the Up and Up means someone who's constantly becoming more successful, who's pushing forward, who's breaking the glass ceilings. And that for me is what that means. And when I think of the demographics of the people that I conducted the research on, and also of the stories that I want to share, a lot of these people had obstacles and hurdles placed in their way that really stopped them from, or could really hinder them from getting to where they want to be in their career. However, they continuously push and they continuously to go on the up and up, step by step, higher and higher, to reach new heights and break new barriers and new boundaries for other people to follow in their footsteps. And so that's why this podcast is called On the Up and Up, because I'm highlighting the stories and achievements of those who are on the up and up, paving a new way, going to new heights, to show other people that, hey, it can be done, and they're doing it. So that's what On the Up and Up means. Now, to my reflection of the last year of podcasting. Also, if you see my eyes, if you're watching this on video, constantly look down. It's because I've got my notes in front of me. So, first, lessons as a new podcaster. Lesson number 1. And everybody says this, and I really actually thought that I was doing it. Don't spend that much money when you get started. Don't buy a lot of fancy equipment. Just get started. A basic phone and a microphone are probably sufficient. And to be honest, I thought I did that, So actually, I'm really grateful to say my old boss, huge shout out to Garrett McGowan, actually loaned me or gave me his old podcasting mic. And that's what I started out with in the very beginning. And in addition to that, I just had an iPhone that I was always recording the episodes on, which I thought was good. But unfortunately, that microphone that I initially had, I struggled to get the audio right. So if you tune into episode 1, you hear a ton of echoing, which is partially a problem of the room that I recorded in. Typical German, so-called Altbau, so old buildings, have high ceilings, which means there was a huge echo. However, the gain, I think it's called, on the mic, for some reason, I don't know if I dropped it or something before and I messed up the microphone, but the gain was very high, which basically means anytime we would laugh or talk or something, it was kind of screechy in sound. And so I was like, okay, I cannot, especially for a podcast that at that time was audio only, I cannot continue to put out episodes with this very, very screechy audio. That's like the quickest way to get people to stop listening. At least that's what I thought. So I ended up going on a website called Grover, And I ended up just renting 2 microphones, like a Rode Procaster mic, as well as like this kind of fancy audio interface, I think from Steinberg, the UR44C. I'm looking at it right now, that's why I'm looking to the sides. And I was like, okay, we kick it off with that. Perfect, ready to go. Once again, to spending too much money too soon. The thing is, I thought with renting it, it would at least be cheaper to get started. And I also forced myself to rent it for 1 year so that I'd be forced to commit fully to podcasting for 1 year because I don't have to pay for it and I can't get out of that contract, which for someone like myself was good. On the other hand, the equipment that I bought was just way too fancy for my skill level. Like, I still have it here. Honestly, I still don't really know how to use it to its full potential. And I probably could have just found some cheaper other microphones to use that I could have just purchased right off the bat rather than locking myself into a contract. So yeah, while I did think I was being smart with how I got it started, I would say I still spent too much money. And also, about 2 months after I got started with podcasting, I ended up finding a location here in Berlin called Noisy Rooms, where I'd actually just go and record podcast episodes, and they have all the equipment that I need, and all I have to do is book a room for around 14 to 18 euros per hour. And so I was like, oh, well, especially because I was struggling to find a location that like killed 2 birds with 1 stone. There's a location and they have the equipment and you just pay the fee every time you go in. But here we are, alas. I learned the hard way. So while I thought I was being smart and I thought I was saving money, I definitely could have saved more money. So what is the lesson out of this? When you start podcasting, or if you're interested in podcasting, try not to buy fancy equipment. Check around your neighborhood and see if there are any recording studios near you with an affordable price. And if there are, go there first, because the best thing about it is you get a location and the equipment that you need to get started. And honestly, a lot less hassle, because I used to tug all this equipment around Berlin. It was heavy, and then I'd end up recording in a location that had a crazy echo, and it made for some rough first episodes. But hey, you live and you learn. So, to the second thing that I did incorrectly when I started podcasting. I pre-recorded too many episodes too soon. In the beginning, and I had an outline of who I wanted to have on the podcast for the first season, and I reached out to all of them, which was great. Actually, I had a higher response rate than I expected. I expected a lot of people to say no, but a lot more people said yes than no, which, guys, don't be scared to ask people to come on your podcast. Just put it out there, and I'm actually pretty sure that there will be a pretty decent turnout. However, because of that, I ended up front loading, because I thought, okay, if I pre-record a ton of episodes, then I can just pre-edit everything, and then I can just have everything on my 2-week posting schedule. However, if it's on a 2-week posting schedule, I really only need 3 episodes or 2 episodes for about a month, or it's just 3 episodes for 6 weeks. While for some, I understand why you would pre-record a lot and you would front load, what the issue is for a newbie with doing something like that is that because you're not so familiar with conducting interviews, you're going to make a lot of the same mistakes over and over and over again. So you don't get to quickly course correct, nor do you get the feedback of people who've listened to your episodes so that you can improve for the next one. So instead, I made the same mistakes multiple times on the pre-recorded episodes, and then I put them out there, and then I was getting feedback from people, and then they would listen to the next episode and it would still be the same mistakes that I made in the first one. And I, of course, can't improve that, right? So my suggestion is, if you're releasing like me every 2 weeks or even once a month, then take the time to pre-record maybe 1 or 2 episodes instead, then see what the feedback is like, pre-schedule the next ones, course correct, and improve a little bit more along the process. To the third issue that I made a lot when I started podcasting. How do I put this? This didn't actually happen a lot, but it happened one major time. And I would say, don't force yourself to record when you're not emotionally in the right headspace. So for me, the beginning of this year, I was going through a pretty tough situation emotionally, and I was rocked. Like, a situation that made me cry very often, and I was pretty down. And regardless, I remember after that situation, I like a day or two later had a podcast recording, and I said, you know what, it'd be a great distraction. Let me go record the episode. But the challenge there for me was that I was not mentally there for the episode and the conversation. And so even for myself, when I go back and I listen to that particular episode, I feel like the episode could have been a lot better. I could have asked a lot better questions. I could have been more into it and it would have been a lot more interesting for listeners to listen to if I had been in that right headspace at the time. And I just wasn't, which, you know, you live and you learn. And I also do know that I can't always be in the perfect headspace for each episode, but if I'm in such a low like I was at that time, there's honestly no point in recording an episode. It's not fun for the guests. As much as I'm trying to finesse, like, I'm enjoying it and I'm having fun with it, I'm honestly not mentally there, which means for you all as listeners, you're probably not getting that much out of the episode, or whatever you're getting out of the episode is probably very just surface level or uninteresting. So my key takeaway there from that is don't do an episode when you're in such a low place. Alrighty, and now to the third, oh wait, did I just say third before? Sorry. To the fourth issue that I made when I started podcasting. Honestly, y'all, if you're interested in podcasting or doing an interview, don't ask people to introduce themselves. I learned that the hard way. Asking people to introduce themselves, honestly, just ends up awkward. And this was no matter how many times I sent the interview guide out to the guests before and I asked them to prepare their introduction and everything. And they also knew what we were talking about before. But for whatever reason, I always ran into this issue where I would ask the question, hey, would you mind introducing yourself? And the guest would immediately freeze up or feel a bit awkward about how to introduce themselves. So, for example, I'd say to myself, hey, Janine, why don't you introduce yourself? And the guest would be like, yeah, so I'm Janine, 27, grew up in Germany. Yeah, I did my bachelor's here and my master's in this, and now I do that. As you heard from the example that I just gave, there's a lot of ums in there. It's very awkward. It's oftentimes not a very targeted introduction specifically to what the episode is about or specifically what we're speaking about. And it's just kind of a horrible way to catch the audience within the first couple of minutes, which I have learned is incredibly important to podcasting, because within the first 5 minutes, either people are in or they're out with your episode. So my suggestion, when you have someone come to your podcast as a guest, when they come and you're having your first conversation with them, massage it a little bit. So what I would typically do is I would just start chatting with them. I would go through the briefing document, the interview guide, quickly just go through the questions that we were going to discuss, ask them if they have any questions, but also just have a bit of small talk first. Then afterwards, I would then kind of go straight into the conversation with a more pointed question to allow them to just get comfortable with the conversation, and asking them something along the lines of, all right, what are 3 things about you that people don't know? And just allowing them to kind of think of something more fun, more creative. Like I said, going more into the small talk first and then transitioning into the episode. And to point number 5, or to lesson number 5, I still struggle with being a bit closed, impersonal in talking about myself on episodes. And I would say my reason for this is I always thought that when you have a guest on a podcast, you as interviewer, just ask your questions. It's not about you. It's about the guest. I invited them on the podcast, and some guests, especially selfishly, I invite them on the podcast because there's something I want to learn about them, if I'm honest with you. And so because of that, I oftentimes don't really want to share much about myself because I just want to hear what they're up to. And also I'm like, it's not about me. Y'all don't want to hear about what I have to say. However, early on in the podcasting journey, I got a lot of feedback around this. People were constantly saying, actually, Janine, it would be great to have you talk more about yourself and your opinion and what you think of what the guest is sharing. And that was actually a very interesting feedback, because it's like, oh, y'all actually care. And then somebody said it this way: you're the one thing on the podcast that's going to be consistent each and every episode, which means eventually you're building a relationship with your audience, and then there's the guest who's coming as well. So bear in mind that to build a relationship with your audience, you're going to need to share more about yourself, and you're going to need to be a little bit more personal, and also it feels more authentic when you're being more yourself. That is something I'm still working on, and to be honest, I have to say that I still find it especially challenging when I have someone on the podcast when it comes to rebuttaling what they're saying or disagreeing with them, because I don't want them to feel uncomfortable or like they're being put on the spot, or that this is going to be a bit more of a hostile situation. At the same time, what I said in the very beginning of the podcast when I introduced it is, it's the podcast created to encourage critical conversations. So for critical conversations to happen, especially if it's just an interviewee and myself, then I am going to need to be a little bit more forward with what I think and disagree with. So that's been a learning process, and honestly, I would say the lesson learned here is that I do have to be more personal, but now taking the steps towards learning how to do that, which means listening to other podcasters and how they do it helps. Secondly, slowly getting myself into it, not beating myself up, but I also now go back and I listen to old episodes and I think, oh, yeah, I definitely could have been a little bit more direct on this particular topic. And also, if during the interview I did not share what I really thought, or I was quiet about my disagreement, now sometimes I also in the interlude will share what I was actually thinking in that moment and my perspective with the guests. It's a learning process. I'm going to get there. But to all of you who are potentially aspiring podcasters or thinking of how to make your conversations more interesting, remember to be personal, to share your stories, and also be okay with disagreeing, and don't be shy to let your disagreement shine on the episode, so to say. Alrighty, so to the next part of part 1. What went well? Honestly, I'd say one of the things that went really, really well with kicking off the podcast is I started it for fun, and I didn't put a lot of pressure on myself as compared to other things that I have in my life. So because of that, I actually took it quite slow, and for each season, I kind of gave myself a core goal that I had for that season. So for season 1, core goal was just to get started with podcasting, learning how to be consistent, having a bit of a posting schedule and ritual, and then that was all. If I could just do that, I was going to be a happy gal. The other thing that I also had, for example, for season 2 was, okay, understanding where I need more support, and then kind of going out there and reaching out to people to further support me with that. So I wanted to understand, could I actually convince someone to support me with the marketing, even though I can't afford to pay anyone, but convince them enough through the mission and the goal of the podcast to get them involved. And huge shout out to my girl Daenerys for joining me on the journey of getting this podcast marketing together. And this was also a huge shout out to my friends at Vern, especially Dee and Juliet, who supported me with the podcast rebranding and making it look a lot more professional. So if you go on our Instagram and you scroll, you'll quickly see what the old branding looked like and the new branding looked like. And I'm so appreciative for them for actually just supporting me on getting the podcast to look a lot better. The other thing that went really, really well is just putting myself out there. So I said to enough people in the beginning that I wanted to start a podcast, and that forced me to have some sort of accountability, and I didn't realize that until now, actually reflecting on it. That helped me to have accountability to, I actually have to create a podcast because I've talked about it so much that it just needs to be done. And so that was actually the first thing that got me to get this podcast started, was putting myself out there and telling a ton of people that, hey, I want to create a podcast. Eventually, enough people will ask you, or enough people asked me at least, what's happening with the podcast, that I ended up feeling that I needed to be accountable and actually create the podcast that I've been wanting to create. So the other part of also putting myself out there that really helped was when I just got started, I actually applied to have my podcast have a live recording at Podfest Berlin, which, mind you, at that point, my podcast was probably like 2 weeks old at that point. But nevertheless, I was like, it would so be cool to have my podcast be a part of Podfest Berlin. And then I was thinking to myself at the time, okay, but like, you're 2 weeks into it. Are you even going to have anyone that shows up? Like, and I thought to myself, you know what? Actually, it doesn't matter if anyone shows up. I just wanted to have the experience and understand what it's like to have a live podcast. And I was like, I hope I can convince someone. Huge shout out to Ana Alvarez for being the guest that came through and speaking with me on that episode. And also a huge love and hug to the people that actually did show up. It was a small crowd, but it really meant the world to me that I think it was around 6 people that were in that room. Around 4 or 5 of them were friends, and then there were like 2 or 3 stragglers that came in who were just through the Podfest audience. And yeah, it may have been small, but it was just so cool to understand what that first live podcasting experience is. And for example, to my point about putting yourself out there, because I had told so many people that I wanted to do a live podcast, I actually got the opportunity to have a second live podcast not too long after that at PodCon Berlin, all thanks to Deborah Choi and Founderland, who gave me the opportunity to have a live recording in front of almost 100 people, actually, with the pitch doctor himself, Christoph Solich, who was so great and gracious to come out and actually record that episode with me as well. So really putting yourself out there, you really can't get anything negative back. Of course, you're always going to have people who are going to be like, do we really need a podcast? What's the purpose of it? Yada, yada. There's always going to be people who question it or even be naysayers. But putting yourself out there also puts you in a position to be able to receive opportunities. So that was something that went really well for me in the first season. And I'm actually really looking forward to the next year and putting myself out there more and seeing. So I would say maybe goal for the next year of On the Up and Up is maybe 4 live podcast recordings in the next year. Why not? Keep the trend going, right? With that being said, now to part 2 of this episode. And this part is a little bit more personal because I want to reflect on my own journey. And what would I say about the last year? It's been a lot. And I would say for the most part in a lot of great ways. And great ways in, for example, the podcast has actually grown a lot, which I'm really proud of, and it makes me really happy to see. I would also say that for myself personally, I've had the opportunity to do a TEDx. I had the opportunity to have my research published in a journal. And so these kind of things have been really phenomenal, work-wise, career-wise. Things have been going really well at work. I got promoted. So there were just a lot of really good things that were going on. So I really can't complain about this past year. However, how do I put this? I definitely can't complain about this past year. And I would say I know as compared to other years, this is a really great year. And for anyone who's looking on the outside in, I'm sure it looks really fantastic. Yeah. I could imagine that you're thinking, okay, like she's got it together. Things seem to be going really well for her. And I would say, yeah, that's true. But there's also a bit of a dual reality to that, in the sense that, yes, I've been accomplishing a lot. Things are moving well. It's a pretty exciting time. And I'm tired. I'm tired. I'm exhausted. Honestly, I'm tired. And I would say the reason for that is that this past year I've put a lot of things on my plate. It's the podcast. It's another particular activity that I will be sharing with you all very soon. And it's been maintaining my full-time job. And then on top of it, personal life, trying to go out, meet with friends, balance that, work out, eat healthy, all those kind of things. And it's also been a year of a lot of personal learning and growth. And maybe this is something with me coming more into my own and understanding who I am. So because of that, it's been a lot. And I find myself being very tired. So what does that mean tangibly? I guess I could say there were really 3 core things that have gone on for me this year. One, like I said, I just put too many things on my plate, which means I am and was always super busy, with way too many commitments, with way too many expectations, and not only expectations of me onto myself, but people with expectations on me, where I have to deliver, and it makes it a lot. The thing about me is that I love to work. I'll be very honest. I'm a workaholic. Some people, they have hobbies. They like to do their sports. They like to draw, paint, play an instrument. My hobby is working. I genuinely love what I do. And that's a beautiful thing, and it's a privilege for me to be able to say that. it's also a double-edged sword in the sense that I will give my everything to the things that I'm working on, which means I also, sometimes I'm a bit of a yes lady because I've accomplished a lot and I know that I can juggle a lot of things at the same time. This past year, I've said yes to a bit too many things, which has resulted in a lot of very late nights working, a lot of intense periods of how am I going to get all of these things done at the same time. It just a lot of stress onto myself. And so what I'm kind of realizing is I just need time to rest. And to be very, very honest, I just want to be bored. And I know that kind of sounds ridiculous to say, but I do believe boredom is a way to facilitate creativity and thoughts and to really think through things. And when your mind is constantly going, whether it's you're working a lot and then you're going to social media and then you're watching a YouTube video to like relax and unwind and go to sleep, my brain just never has time to just process all of the information that's there, and I don't have the time to think through it all. And I do believe and know that contributes even more to my level of exhaustion. And so I just need some time to rest and to work through things. And so that means in the next year, I have a lot of major things coming up, and I can't share them yet, but a lot of no's are going on right now, and I am reducing the scope of things that I'm involved in. Which also actually relates now to the second core thing that's been going on in my life, and it's the changing relational dynamics, I would say. It's a very diplomatic way of saying I'm setting some boundaries, and that also goes to me setting boundaries on the amount of work I'm doing all the time, but also setting boundaries in my personal and professional relationships. This is a bit of a tough one. If you know me, I would say that I am a bit of a people pleaser. I like to make sure that there's just harmony. And that means that I'm sometimes not the best at being very clear with my boundaries. At the same time, I also will like I said, acknowledge that I like to be the person who can do it all, over deliver. I like to seem like a bit of a superwoman. And that's something that I'm working on within myself. But these changing relational dynamics have to happen now, and I'm realizing that I'm also not this little girl that I was when I first moved to Germany, or even the same person that I was 2 years ago. And I need to be very clear from now on with making sure that I also do what's important for me, and also establishing the types of relationships that I think are healthy, especially for myself long term and with the goals that I have for the future. So this means relationally shifting and changing the way I interact with people on a professional level, but also on a personal level, and also internally working on how I am influenced by the opinions of other people. So this has been a tough one, especially when it comes to personal relationships, because of course, when you start trying to change the status quo of the way things are, that also means you're going to be hit with conflict. And that's essentially what's happening. So, especially on a personal level, I think, y'all listen to the episode with my mom, and you know I have a very, very close relationship with her. However, now that I'm going through this shift on being very clear about my boundaries and really trying to get people to understand that when I say no, it's no, and it's not a no and you try to convince me and maybe I'll compromise. No, I have said no, and please respect that it's a no. These kind of things really do change the way a relational dynamic goes. And so I'm working through that, and it does take a bit of an emotional toil on me. And with being, like I said, already exhausted with the amount of things I have on my plate, now also managing the changing relational dynamics, it's a lot physically and mentally, emotionally. So that's the other core thing that's currently going on. But I also accept that this is just that chapter of my life, and I'm going along with it. It's going to be a lot, but we get through it somehow. So I'm definitely going to try to maybe get myself back into therapy again, because I do know I'm going to need this for this next phase. And that also all culminates into the third core thing that I have going on, which is I'm finally at a point in my life where I'm ready to take a bet on myself. I would say over the last couple of years, I've always put my projects and my interests on the side, and I've always worked on them, but I've always worked at them at like a lower capacity. I'd say like 30%. I've given the rest of myself and concentration fully into the other things, which maybe is my full-time job or other commitments that I have. And that's partially because, yes, there are certain goals that those things were contributing to, so that was necessary at the time. But I would also say out of fear is the reason why I always put my projects on the side, because I feared not having stability, not having a stable income, not presenting or being this version of myself that I thought that I wanted to be at that time, you know? And now as I get older and I see my interest and my level shifting and really understanding what are my values and what I know would really bring me joy, a lot has really changed in the things that I want to spend my time doing, which means this next year for myself and for the podcast, I'm really going to be focusing more on taking a bet on the projects and the things that I want to. And that also means a lot of things are going to be changing. It means that I'm probably going now into a phase of instability, which I don't know if I'm really ready for, but I guess no one's ever really ready to be unstable. But it also means that I'm going into a period of loneliness, because the road I'm choosing is a lonely one. It's not one that's frequently walked by a lot of people. And yeah, it's going to be a bit of a tough one, especially because I don't really have anyone to rely on besides myself. Yes, I have friends, but you know, like, how do I say? There's no extra security blanket or anything else, right? Like, I only have me to make sure that things work out. I only have me to provide for me. So that is a bit scary now in this next phase, in this next chapter. But at the same time, I also know that I would not be happy with myself if I didn't at least try to take these bets on myself. I feel like I'm being a little bit ambiguous right now, not very specific, but it's like I said, I can't fully share everything yet, but I will have y'all walk with me on that journey of what that means moving forward when the time comes. So yeah, those are the three core things. It's this period right now of having too many things on my plate and now narrowing it down to what's the most important. It is putting boundaries in place and coping with the changing relational dynamics that I have on both a professional and personal level. And then it's now also wanting to make sure that I take a bet on myself in this next year, because yeah, last year has been really cool. There's been a lot of accomplishments, but for me to be really able to elevate, to continue going on the up and up, these core three things have to change. And now, yeah. With that being said, that's pretty much almost the end of the episode. So what does that look like now? What am I wishing for the next year of On the Up and Up? One, I really want to interact more with all of you. So on social media, I would love to understand, what are y'all going through? What are you building? What are your companies, your ideas? What are you working on right now? I would love to learn more about what's also going on in your minds and even cater more of these episodes and conversations and interviews towards your interests. Also, I'd love to do more live recordings. So actually, one of my favorite things about live recordings is that it's fun to interact with the audience and just get their real-time reactions to things. And so I would love to do more live recordings. And as I said before, I think we're going to try to go for another 4 to 5 in the next year. So yeah, it would be fun to just have more contact with you guys as listeners as well. So if you're in Germany, especially in Berlin, I'd love to see you at a live recording at some time. The other thing that I really wish for the On the Up and Up in the next year is I'd like to bring it more to a professional level. So more high quality content, really, especially around the videos, less grainy videos, more high quality videos. And yeah, I would also want to continue interviewing really cool guests, but also improving my interview skills. So I'm working on that as well now, trying to do a little bit of self-learning and also, yeah, courses around this. And also just trying out different episode formats. So for example, this one was a solo episode, which was really interesting to try out. I would also love to try out story times and all those other kind of things, which you'll also see very soon. So with that, I'd love to throw the question back at all of you. What do you wish for On the Up and Up in the next year? I would love to hear. And for those of you who are just getting started with your own podcasting or content creation journeys, what's your experience been like so far? Can we talk about it? Can we have like a little bit of a community around this? Because it can be a bit of a lonely journey. And I'd love to have other people to discuss this with as well. So I'd really love to hear from all of you. And I have to say, I'm not really sure how to end off this conversation and interaction. But I guess what I would say is, please follow On the Up and Up on all of your favorite podcast streaming or social media channels. I will link everything in the show notes. If you're more interested about my journey, especially since I was a bit ambiguous about what exactly I'm up to and what's going to be changing soon, please do follow me on social media as well. I will be sharing more updates there as the time moves forward. And besides that, the next episode will be back to our regularly scheduled programming with a really, really awesome interview. So I can't wait to share that one with all of you. So until then, as I always like to say, onwards and upwards, y'all. And I'll speak to you soon.